led me to a period, a very brief period, where I was sort of flirting with the idea of atheism. It was like there can't be a God if all this is being allowed to be happening. And it was John Coltrane's music that touched me and had the power to bring tears to my eyes. And I couldn't describe them as tears of joy or tears of sadness, but I just know I listened to Coltrane. In particular, one of the earliest recordings I listened to was his "A Love Supreme," and that just reawakened in me this knowledge that yes, there definitely is a God out here.
Disinformation is spreading.
There will be a surprise outbreak.
We only
Is
have
the
so many
issue
beds.
of pandemic.
No social distancing at all.
They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply.
Where's the mask? Where's the glove?
One expert says a
get away from all of these people.
We all need some good news.
A message for all the healthcare workers out there.
Thank you.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand. We're gonna make it through this.
Eric Jackson has been a fixture on the New England airwaves for almost 5 decades. He began his radio career at Boston University's WBTU AM radio. Then for several years at NPR's WBUR, Harvard's radio station WHRB, WILD, and WBCN, before landing at NPR's WGBH, that has been his on-air home for the past 45 years. In addition to being an award-winning announcer and producer, Eric holds the distinct title of Dean of Boston Jazz Radio. He is currently part-time professor of African American Studies on the faculty in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern University, where he is also a co-host of the Friends of John Coltrane Memorial Concert, which is the world's oldest annual performance tribute to the musical and spiritual legacy of John Coltrane, and is now in its 43rd year. Eric Jackson, welcome to 19 Stories.
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. And we're going to trust that third time is a charm, given we've been attempting to do this for a while.
Yes. I did want to just say, first station I started at was WTBU at BU. And that was in 1969. So actually, I've been on the air in Boston for 51 years.
Well, we certainly don't want to shortchange you. We really don't, because that is quite the accomplishment. And actually, let's dive into that, because for being on the air, I wrote for almost 5 decades, which now I know is over 5 decades. And given how much we know radio changes all the time, what do you attribute your longevity to? Because that is quite the accomplishment.
First of all, I always very quickly say, I've been blessed. I mean, what else can I say? I've been blessed.
Right.
There's certainly been loads of talented people along the way, but I've been blessed to be able to stay around this long. I also had some ideas about radio and presentation and things like that, which I think might have made me stand out. And part of it was just continuing to stay on the air. There were times when, especially in the early days, when I went from making almost no money to making no money. And my idea was, well, if you go off the air, people will forget you. If you stay on the air, then people will remember you. So it's not that big a deal to go from making very little money to making no money when you're 21, 22 years old. So I just decided I was going to stay on the air, and I literally moved from station to station. In some cases, doing my last show on one day at one station, and doing my first show at the other station the next day, because I just felt it was great to be a presence. As far as presentation is concerned, too, I also thought that, people remark how I sound like myself. And thank goodness I do. And that's what I've always tried to be like on the radio. I never wanted to have a radio voice. In fact, when I first started off, some of the first shows I did were actually rhythm and blues shows. You know, a lot of rhythm and blues announcers would have these raps that they would, do. And, I tried doing that and I'd break out laughing in the middle of them. It's like, I can't do that, man. You know, that's ridiculous. You
You
know,
meant not only sounding like your natural voice, but also sounding like who you are as a person.
right? Yes, yes. And adding to that, especially doing evening radio and overnight radio, you're coming into somebody's living room or maybe even their
Bedroom,
bedroom,
sure. Hmm.
so that you want to come in and sound warm and friendly. You don't want to be overbearing or overpowering
Jarring them out of
or
their
right. Yeah. Yes, yes. So that was something I always thought was very important. And the guitarist Grant Green, I met him in the 70s, and he came to my apartment once, and we're sitting there having a talk. At the time, I was working at WILD and WBCN. There was a few months where those two stations overlapped. Now, WILD was the only black formatted station in the Boston area, commercial station. WILD was mostly geared towards a younger white audience, big rockers. It was a big rocker station. And Grant Green said to me, you have to realize the responsibility you have. You have these two audiences right there. He said, you have to carry yourself in a certain way, representing this music.
Mm.
He wasn't really, I didn't get the impression he was talking about carrying, in one sense, carrying myself in a certain way, but I had to represent the music in a certain way. And I've always tried to, when I'm on the air or when I'm in public, remember that I'm the uh, representative of this music and, in certain senses, of this culture. And that's a burden to bear, but it's one I've enjoyed bearing. I guess I'd say.
And it's a beautiful piece of advice that he gave you, because I understand that your father, Sam Jackson, also known as Mr. Sam, was the first African American radio announcer in New England, and that he would often appear on your show prior to his passing.
Right. He in 1947, I think it was WHMO in Providence. I guess they must have put out an ad looking for a vocalist for their house band. And he went to the station to inquire about that job. And I guess they sat him down and said, after they talked to him, and said, why don't you have a seat here? We're going to talk it over and we'll let you know. So while he was sitting, I guess, in a hallway or something, waiting, um, these two guys came out, and he didn't know who they were, and they started talking about jazz. And my father got into the conversation, and he didn't realize that one of the people that had talked to him was actually standing behind him listening to the conversation. So he walked up and said to my father, "Do you know anything about jazz?" And my father said, "Well," and this is typical fashion for my father, "I know a hell of a lot more than those two do." And they turned out to be the big guys at the station too. So they hired him as an announcer. That was in 1947. He was only on to about 1950, and then my family left Providence and moved to Camden, New Jersey. That, of course, was before the time when the masses had tape recorders. There were some tape recorders floating around, but most people didn't own tape recorders. So I never heard his show. My
Oh,
brothers, I had two older brothers, they heard his show, but I had never heard his
oh,
show.
that's so sad that you don't have that recorded.
Right. So when I started at GBH, I started inviting him to come on to the station and whenever he came up from New Jersey to visit. And certainly at first, some of his old listeners would call up so excited because they remembered him. They knew who he was, you know.
Wonderful. What a beautiful story, too,
Right,
of how you
right.
got
Yeah.
started.
And the Father's Day too. We did a show either on Father's Day or the closest work day of me working near Father's Day, And I'd get people who would call up in tears sometimes because they would be thinking about their own fathers. I get comments like, it's really great that you could sit for 5 hours in a room with your father. I don't think I could sit with my father for 5 hours in a room without fighting.
Wow.
I mean, you get all those kinds of comments, and people would. There's still people now who say, of all the shows you did, I think those are some of my favorite shows when you sat there with your father. And having been in radio and being a jazz lover all his life, he would sit there and just tell these stories that I had never heard before. Well, when you go buy Billie Holiday a drink, you had to buy her a Chihuahua one too. What?
Wait. But yeah, that's not just a sidebar. Okay.
Right, 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 yes.
Those are
So,
very rich, wonderful stories. And maybe have you ever thought of on future Father's Days, revisit those times that he was on air with you and replay them?
I've definitely thought of it. Unfortunately, in this litigious world we live in today, I'm not sure how easy that is to do.
Mm.
I don't. Maybe it is. I've asked about doing it before, and the response was not very
Why
enthusiastic.
would that even be an issue? I'm curious because it's your show and it's like having any other guest if you.
Well, it's a property of WGBH.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right.
So obviously you're in Boston. I know a couple of months ago it was kind of the hotbed of COVID, and I'm sure that affected your time on the air. What I read also is that you had only been off the air 7 months out of your entire career.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. In 1977, I was unemployed for 7 months, and I was going absolutely crazy. I told one interviewer I felt like an artist who had no canvas to paint on
Mm,
because I had all these musical ideas going through my head and no way to
no
express
way
them.
to express them. Yeah, how
Right.
sad.
Right.
And that is the truth because this is your canvas. This is how you
Right. Yes.
communicate your love and reach out to people. And I know you have fans all over the world, or I should say listeners. So how has this shelter in place affected you, your ability to be on the air?
Well, for several months, I wasn't on the air. I've had, besides the fact of my age, I've also had some medical issues, and so pretty much the station told me to stay out of the station, which I certainly wasn't arguing the point. I knew what I thought their intentions were by doing that, so I didn't. That wasn't a problem. But did get antsy to get back on the air, and there definitely were people on Facebook who were writing saying, "When are you coming back? When are you coming back?" you know. But what GBH also has a 24/7 jazz stream, and I what they had never done before. The jazz stream they have has no announcers. It just runs without announcers. They were trying to get it to work, the stream to work with a microphone, and have still never gotten it to work with the microphone. But I have been programming on Thursday evenings um, with on live on the stream without the microphone. I've been doing that for a couple months. I'm not sure if that's going to continue because there have been some changes at GBH and sort of reorganization of the music there at WGBH. And so I'm not sure where we're going from here. I have to email my supervisor and ask him, what do we do now at this point?
So are you referring to the live stream, or are you talking about your future at WGBH?
No, 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 no. The program director that we had for 8 to 10 years resigned. Yes, retired rather, retired on June 30th. And so the station has now, there's very little music left on WGBH. There's my show, there's a Celtic music show that's on one day a week, and the jazz stream. They have now merged all of them into something they're calling the music department. And the person who was the classical music program director is now heading that department. But this just happened within the last week. So right now things are a little muddy, and I don't know if they want me to go back on the stream, even if there's no microphone, or what they want me to do at this point.
So, for the listeners who don't understand what that means without a microphone, that means any back announcing or pre-announcing, correct?
Right, yes. I was using Facebook to announce each set on not announce, but list each set as I played the set. That's because the stream was on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night during my regular shift during the pandemic time. It was airing on both the stream and on 89.7. So now if you listened on a phone or a computer and went to the stream is called Jazz 24/7. If you went to that part of the GBH website, it would tell you what I was playing on your screen. But if you were listening on 89.7, there was no way for you to know what I was playing. That's why I was listing what I was playing on Facebook.
Oh, I was wondering how, I would see those posts from you and I wasn't quite sure what that was relating
Right.
to. So, do you feel that by everybody learning to adjust to this new way of programming, that it may have a permanent effect as to how you do your show, or is that something you're just not aware of yet moving forward?
No, I certainly hope that, well, since I am back in the studio, I am using the microphone in the studio. The using the stream without the microphone was something I did, but it's not something I really want to do. And it's again, there are a number of listeners who said that they missed the insights that I would share about the music, the stories that I could tell about the music or the musicians. So that's certainly the way I'd prefer to do things. And I don't see that. I don't see that that's changing. That station is going to change.
Well, that's good to know because maybe we'll be revisiting you at your 60th anniversary.
Right. Maybe not. Maybe not, because I may say, okay, that's enough somewhere before there.
Well, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about before I go more into how COVID has affected you and, your life in Boston, certainly in the music and in radio. But you have a very deep involvement with the John Coltrane Memorial Concert. And given all that's going on, I'm gathering that it will not happen this year.
It's generally in the fall. As far as I know of, it's not even being planned. Since the mid 80s, it's been held on the campus of Northeastern University because one of the founders of the concert, Leonard Brown, was on the faculty there at Northeastern. Unfortunately, Leonard passed away last year, so they did have a concert last year, sort of in remembrance of him, but I'm not sure what the future of the concert is going to be. I know that Northeastern was still hoping that there was going to be a concert, and I think there are a lot of lovers of the music who were also hoping that there would be a concert, but I'm not really sure. I really didn't have anything to do with the planning of the concert, except that Leonard would sometimes come to me and ask me for advice. But for the most part, I was not involved in the actual planning of the concert. And, although I have been associated with the concert, really, sometime Leonard and I couldn't even figure out when I started. Sometime in the late 80s, I began hosting the concert. And, I felt in a lot of ways that I didn't have a permanent gig. They had to ask me every year if they wanted me to host the concert. I didn't feel like, I was an insider. I felt like everybody else, Leonard called me up every year saying, hoping you can do the Coltrane concert this year. I felt that that was tremendous because I'm a big Coltrane fan. So I really appreciated being part of that. But I think my name has became associated with it so much that people linked the two of us together. Coincidentally, though, one of the other founders of the Coltrane concert was a man by the name of Hayes Burnett. He was also, besides being a bass player, he was also the overnight host at WGBH during the time that I was out of work.
Oh,
And,
really?
right.
Interesting.
And I had been, I hung out with him a few times, and I said to him at one point, man, you got to let me fill in, man. I'm going nuts. You have to let me fill in when you need a sub. Uh, so it's as it turns out, the concert was in July. The first the concert was in July of '77, and in August, Hayes decided he was going on the road with either Sun Ra or Pharoah Sanders. I can't remember which. He actually worked with both of them, and he asked me to fill in for him for 2 weeks, and I said yes, happily. And 2 weeks went by, and nobody had heard from him. 3 weeks went by, nobody had heard from him. 4 weeks went by, nobody had heard from him. 5 weeks went by, nobody had heard from him. After 6 weeks, he came back and he said, I don't want to do the show anymore. I want to go play my bass.
I think
And
that was pretty evident.
yeah, yeah, right, yes, yes.
And a bit fortuitous for you as well,
Right,
right?
yes, exactly. That I just sort of fell into the job. I was saying to someone the other day, I've never sent a resume to GBH. I never did any of that. I just sort of fell into the job. It's like,
Isn't that beautiful when that happens?
right, no application. I never did any of that.
Well, I ask you about the Coltrane Memorial Concert because as long as I've known you, that has been a
Yes,
really important part of the work that you do and a real
yes,
joy for
yes.
you. And my hope is that, like a lot of musicians are having to do right now, is go online, and it is possible. I mean, it's definitely more production intensive, but it can happen.
I think one of the issues, though, that Cheryl, is that Leonard's son did the prep work for the concert last year, and actually he lives in D.C. Leonard, when he was there, not only did he, as long as was at the university, he retired actually a few years before he passed away. But as long as he was at the university, Leonard could work at it. There was another professor who was involved with the concert for a while too. And Leonard could get interns to help him work on the concert. When his son took over, he didn't have the kind of on the ground people
Mm, I
um,
see.
working for him. So that I just think coordinating it all is a little bit more tricky for him from DC.
Oh, yeah, even if he was in Boston, it's a big, any undertaking like that, whether it's live or online, is huge, and
Right,
certainly when you're not
right,
in Boston proper. So, well, my hope will be that it can continue for so many reasons,
right,
because how beautiful that it's in its 43rd year. Important to keep
right,
that
right, right.
music, the music of John Coltrane and the legacy alive, and certainly your involvement with it. So, speaking of North,
Before you go on, I just want to
uh
mention that Leonard's son was the owner of the Bohemian Caverns in Washington D.C.
what a rich legacy, really.
Right. Yes. Yes. Uh-huh.
And for you to be part of that, I really hope that can continue for you and also for the listeners, and to keep that alive within the Boston area and at Northeastern University.
Yeah. 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 Me too. Me too.
And you're in the process of designing a curriculum to be able to continue teaching, and you're going to be doing that online. Is that correct?
Yes. And you know, when they first said about teaching online, my first thoughts were, okay, well, basically, I'll do what I was doing and just do it online. But then you realize that, first of all, Northeastern University, like most universities, has students from all over the world. So, although my class usually met from 11:45 to 1:20 on Mondays and Thursdays, well, it's not quite that simple because in Hong Kong, 11:45 here is not 11:45 there. So even the preparation work now has to involve more activities that the students can do without me physically being in their presence.
Clarify how that worked prior to going online. If they're not physically here, how are they able to attend your class
Well,
in the first
they
place?
were here before. I mean, you know,
Oh, I see. Okay.
before, you were enrolled in the class and you came into the class, and um, I did a normal class that I used some materials that were online, and then there was my in-class presentation. But now I probably will record some part of the presentation, which will be part of my presence in the classroom. But then there'll be some sort of discussions that will have to take place more online, maybe using video or text. I start a question, and each student will be asked to participate in the discussion. What are your thoughts on such and such a thing? Why do you think John Coltrane is so important today? And each student would have to give their comments on that question. Now, again, that could be text, or it could be a video of me asking the question, and then the students could reply the same way, either with a video response or with a text response. Test, a quiz, all of that has to be done online.
That's what this time is kind of showing us, is how to reinvent ourselves and reinvent ways of doing things,
Right.
which
Yes.
could
Yes.
be actually a positive thing moving forward. And yet we're
Yes.
very aware of the inadequacies of the availability of Wi-Fi and computers and, a lot of things that we're
Right.
dealing
Right.
with domestically here,
Right.
with having equal opportunities for
Right.
people to study from home. And you mentioned John Coltrane and why it's important to keep the legacy alive. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were studying pre-med and you heard Coltrane and said, change direction, course correct.
Where did you get that from? Where did you get that from, Cheryl?
I was digging deep. Am I wrong? Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right. You're 100%
I
right.
told you, had I known you were such a
No,
VIP
no,
all
don't do
these
that. Don't
years,
do
I
that.
would have had a little bit more respect for you, Mr. Jackson.
Yes, I did hear Coltrane's music, and it totally changed my life. I've even gone so far as to say, one, I grew up in the Christian church. I was an active member, very active member at a very young age in the church. But during the civil rights era, I became very disillusioned with the church because of two incidents, really. One was not a personal incident, but the other was. One was I just couldn't understand why every minister in the country wasn't speaking against racism and discrimination on the pulpit. Martin Luther King is saying this is the number one problem in America today. And I'm hearing preachers who are preaching these nice sermons that aren't even addressing this issue. That just bothered me. I looked at what I knew of Jesus. I said, Jesus went in the temple and turned over
The
the
tables,
tables
yes,
of the
yes.
right. So I said, so there's a time to be nice and peaceful,
Mhm.
but there's a time to get upset. And I just didn't see enough of them that were upset. And then on a personal level, when I was a senior in high school, about 8 of us took over well, I'll use the word take over, but I'll then explain it. It's said that about 8 of us, I'll do this. I'll say this. It's said that about 8 of us took over my high school and closed it for about a week. Now I'll explain what I said. They said we did. Actually, I was president of high school student government. The other 7 were all elected or appointed officials of either previously elected or previously appointed officials of student government or the senior class. So my argument is we didn't take over anything. We're elected officials by the students of this class. We actually wrote up an 8-page petition. We met with the Board of Education in a public meeting. In fact, there were so many people, the chambers for the Board of Education were very small, and the board tried to keep it a closed meeting. And actually, the police came up and said, we think you better let people in. There are so many people downstairs outside of City Hall. We're afraid there could be a riot if you don't let people come into the meeting. So people came in. Now, where I got disillusioned was there were people I knew in my church who I'd known all my life, and or certainly close to all my life. And many of them I thought were treating me like I was a mugger or that I had committed some sort of crime. And I just didn't see that I had done anything wrong. And I just didn't like the way these people were treating me. I just said, I don't understand this in terms of the way I'm understanding Christianity, that they are reacting like this. I just don't see this together with my understanding of what I had been taught Jesus was about. I had to think that with my understanding at that time, said, well, Jesus would have been walking down the street with Martin Luther King.
Absolutely, and yet that's happening now, Eric.
Right? Yes, it is.
I'm a
It is. It
Christian,
is.
and I, am incensed about things that are going on, and that's okay. You know what?
Right.
That
Yeah.
is
Well.
part of the
Yeah.
message, and you're right. Jesus would be walking down the street and really preaching the sermon that more needs to be done as opposed to less, and I think it's interesting given that John Lewis just passed,
Right.
and,
Right.
one of the quotes that I think is so apropos to right now is, never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble, right?
Right.
And
Right.
yet, maybe you can speak to this because it is so apropos to today about how divisive people are over making some good noise.
Right. 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 Well, I think I can't remember the exact quote that President Carter said, but even before all of this, he's talked about what he saw as the good Christian. And in many cases, there were just too many people which is the reason why he made the remarks about, it was about hunger, it was about mistreatment of other people that his remarks were. But um, I think that there are certainly good people who are fighting the fight under the banner of their religion, but there are too many, as we know, the Ku Klux Klan holds up the cross too.
Mhm.
So there are too many who are hiding under a hood, one way or the other, and opposing those things. I think that it led me to a very brief period, where I was sort of flirting with the idea of atheism. It was like there can't be a God if all this is being allowed to be happening. And it was John Coltrane's music that touched me and had the power to bring tears to my eyes. And I couldn't describe them as tears of joy or tears of sadness, but I just know I listened to Coltrane. In particular, one of the earliest recordings I listened to was his "The Love Supreme," and that just reawakened in me this knowledge that yes, there definitely is a God out here, and I may not necessarily understand what is happening, but I know there's a God, and I'm not going in that direction. It was Coltrane and his music that awakened that in
Well,
me.
it's hard not to listen to his music and his playing without being moved.
Right,
And that is the beauty of music.
right,
It
yes,
amazes me sometimes when people can hear such a profound musician or look at a sunset or something that has such intrinsic beauty and not believe in something higher than us and not allow man to take that away because every
right,
single day
right,
that's challenged. So I'm
yeah,
curious
yeah,
how
yeah.
was it expected or was there any kind of idea where, all right, you're going to study pre-med, but now you had a life-changing or life-altering experience. Was that received by your family?
Um, I don't. They didn't make I didn't actually. I never really actually studied music in a formal sense, and I actually left school during my second year, and I've never gone back in a degree program. So I was
I
starting.
think you've done okay, Eric. I'm just going to say it. I think you've done okay. And I wasn't really referring to studying music. I just meant that you knew that you had a different calling, that it wasn't going to be pre-med, that somehow you wanted to be involved with playing this, presenting this music and being involved with music somehow,
But
some way.
sure, I have sort of a joke that I say while my classmates were going off to classes and preparing for their futures, I was sitting in the dormitory listening to music and preparing for my future. Yeah.
That would make a great cartoon. The New Yorker or something.
Right, yeah.
I was, and if you had told me about this, I wasn't aware. And talk about bringing tears to your eyes, because it brought up the memory of someone very special and important to both of us. That in 2012 you were awarded the Duke Du Bois Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yes, yes, yes.
And
That was
I didn't even know
wonderful.
that was an award. And for those who aren't aware of who Duke Du Bois was, can you speak to that for a moment?
Duke Dubois was what they call a promotion man, promo person, which Cheryl also was promo person at one time. And basically, those are the people that, in the days that Duke was around, a lot of record companies had their own promo people. Nowadays, hardly any record company does. Most of that's all done by independents. But they're the people that make sure that records get into the hands of announcers and maybe press people too. And they then do some sort of follow up to see what you think about the record and whether you're going to play the record. And in some cases, you have a relationship with those people over so long that they'll actually say to you, I'm not sure if this is going to work for you or not, but I wanted to bring it to your attention. And Duke also had a habit. He would just say that he was tell me that he was calling about a record that didn't have any links to, except that the person was a friend, and he wanted to help out the friend and make sure that we knew about the records and bring it to our attention. Because sometimes, and it's even worse now, Cheryl, than when you were in the business. We get so much music now. I say without the promo people it would be very difficult, and you get so much music even by people who you've never heard before. You don't know anybody on the CD and you don't know any of the songs. And for those people, the person who does the promo job is a lifesaver because they tell you, well, Eric, this is something that I think you might be interested in. Because if you've got 30, 40 records like that, why am I going to listen to your CD as opposed to somebody else's CD that fits that same description? So the promo person would sort of guide you around. Duke worked with a number of artists in making suggestions about recordings. I mean, he was just a great guy. I was thinking the other day, and I don't even know why this came up. One year, I was in New York at one of the conferences, and there was another announcer from WGBH who had never been to a conference. And we walked into a restaurant to get something to eat. And when we got into the restaurant, Duke was in the restaurant. He came over and spoke to us and talked with us for a while. And then he left. And when it was time for us to go, I called the waiter over and asked for the check, and the waiter said, "Oh, he paid your bill already." It's like, what? Really? Really?
That's Duke.
He never.
That was Duke. What
Right? Yeah.
he was beautiful human being, and I didn't know there was a Lifetime Achievement Award in his honor. So who actually presents that?
There is a trade publication, which was a print publication at one time. Now it's just online, called Jazz Week, and they actually publish a listing of airplay on jazz radio stations and programs across the country. By Wednesday of each week, I have to call in with a report of what I'm playing and how much I'm playing that. And they compile all that data and have a listing of, I don't even know how many it is. Maybe it's top 50 recordings receiving airplay on jazz radio across the country. And shortly after Duke died, they started that. Well, actually, I don't remember how much time passed. They started that award. Now, the only way you get into that is the people who are already winners of the award vote on who the next person is who gets into that group. So it's a relatively small group of people even now. We just finished the voting the other day for this year's winners, which I won't
Oh,
announce.
come on, Eric. Give us a peek inside.
Actually, 2020 was actually the year my show got cut back from full time to part time. And my first reaction was, "Oh, this is a sympathy vote," because they got my show back. And I was told, "No, the voting for this actually happened several months ago. So no, this is not a sympathy vote. You got voted in, and then the station cuts back your hours, but you were already selected." in the group. It's mostly announcers, but it also promotional people are in, and there've been a couple record label owners like Joe Fields, who owned High Note and Savant, and at one time Muse Records. Was a member before he passed away. So it's a small group of people, and we don't do much of anything other than you get this presentation that recognizes the work that you do for the music and for the jazz community.
Well, I think Duke would be very pleased to know that you are the recipient of this award. And I know that in 2017, your show, Eric in the Evening, in case we haven't mentioned that, also received Jazzweek's Best Terrestrial Station.
Yes. Terrestrial means a radio station on your FM dial in this case. Non-terrestrial is satellite or internet. That's what that means. I've also won several other awards from Jazz Week too. I won Best Programmer, I think 2 or 3 times over the years.
Well, Eric, if I sat here and named everything that you've won, we'd be on for 3 hours. But
can I tell you one of the things I'm really proud of?
Absolutely.
Around the beginning of the century, Massachusetts College of Art, selected me as one of the 100 most culturally influential Bostonians of the 20th century. And I just thought, wow, that's a big deal.
That is the big deal. That is quite the honor, because, what is the jury that chooses that, other than the fact that you have a 50-year legacy within Boston?
And plus, there are a lot of people who think of Boston as this big cultural center, and to get that in a place that a lot of people think of as this hub of culture, to me was pretty special. I was really me.
It's very special, something to be really, really proud of. And I want to ask you, because I can't even believe that we're almost at an hour. I mean,
now, Cheryl, you and I can talk.
We can talk. We
for
can
quite a
dish it.
Right.
But I'm so fascinated. You can know someone for, I think we've known each other for 38 years, and yet who thinks to ask certain, it's like what you said about your father, hearing stories that you had never heard before, and yet he's your dad. But tell me how you came to be chosen as a curator for the American Museum of Jazz in Kansas City.
Well, again, it goes back to Leonard Brown. Leonard Brown was named as I can't remember the official title, but basically he was the historian on the project. And when he approached me about selecting the music for the museum, their listening stations, and he approached me about selecting the music. Well, when he came to me, I said, oh, talk to Phil Schaap. Who is, of course, a well-known historian, who's done a lot of restoration projects on recordings, has been on the air in New York for years. But for some reason, he and Leonard didn't click. I have no idea why. And Leonard came back to me and said, man, I want you to do it. So it was an interesting project because I had to select music, and then I had to deal with the whole rights thing. And we had problems, for example, with Max Roach. I had heard that he was an early supporter of the museum, and then he had some disagreement with the person who was in charge of setting up the museum. And so when I started suggesting music, Max was turning down everything. I was even told at one point, well, maybe we can't include Max in the museum. And I said, that's, how could you not
have
not
how can
Max?
you do that?
So I selected, I can't remember the tune, but it was a Bud Powell tune where Max has a pretty prominent drum part. That was a way we could get Max represented in the in the museum rather, was by, using somebody else's music with him featured on it. Leonard also sponsored conferences on Charlie Parker there at the museum that I spoke at. The first one was very large and very intimidating because Max was there, Milt Jackson was there, Al Gray was there, Billy Taylor was there, Clora Bryant. There were loads of musicians there. And I'm supposed to speak. And I'm like, wow, really? You look and see who's there. It's like, what?
Even you can be intimidated at times, right?
Well, another time, I got asked to speak in Providence and on the history of jazz. and James Moody sitting in the first row. It's like, what?
No pressure.
You know? Right, yes. I think that's exactly what I said. No pressure. Only James Moody sitting here. you know. But yeah, and most of the thing, a lot of the big things that I participated in, I thought were learning experiences. And that's certainly working on the museum required me to do a lot of digging, studying history and research and listening to music. So I did get paid, but part of the reward was just finding out that much more about the music of Kansas City, the city itself, in that particular time period. That was certainly a reward right there, to be able to learn all that much more about the music, how Kansas City fit into the overall scheme of jazz history in particular. So that was all very exciting to do.
Now, did you also spend time in the city and get to be part of the ribbon cutting of
I
it?
was there.
You were.
I was there for the opening day. I remember meeting. I don't think Pat was there, but I remember meeting Pat Metheny's mother and father, and his brother Mike had lived here in Boston, so I knew his brother Mike, and he introduced me to Pat's mother and father. They are from Missouri, and so I was introduced to them. I met a lot of very interesting people while I was there. I didn't actually wasn't a participant in the ceremony. It's been a year since I've been there, but I've been to the museum 3 times for the opening and for these 2 Charlie Parker conferences that were there. I love to go back, and I always wanted my parents to go, and they never were able to get out there. The funny story is too that my voice is in one exhibit, and it's actually something I'm not really happy about because I didn't think about it, but they have me speaking in the first person. And it's like, well, I didn't really want to speak in the first person. I was demonstrating something or doing something. It's like I shouldn't have been speaking in the first person.
What a beautiful legacy to be part of. Now, so these are permanent installations, right? These are not something that are changed out. This is part of the
Yeah, as
actual.
far as I know, they are still there. I met someone from the museum at a conference in January of this year, and as far as I know of, the musical selections I made are still there. They've changed the way you listen to them, but the selections I think are still there.
So, Eric, getting back to kind of the where we're at right now, and certainly what your city has gone
Yeah.
through, what our nation is going through, do you have any fears or concerns regarding the pandemic? And if so, what are they?
I certainly see that everything has changed, and there's certainly a new way of doing everything now, and that may be permanent, but it may be that our whole American lifestyle has changed and it may never get back to being the way it was. So that would be a concern that I have for not just the Boston area, but for America, the interactions between people in a time when computers and phones were already taking away from our interactions. We're interacting even less at this point. So I think that's the major concern
Hmm.
that I have. I mean, obviously I'm not in this area, but how do you date? I mean, how do you meet someone in these circumstances? And then after you've met them, what do you do? I mean, just think about that. Just the simple thing of first even meet them, and then how do you continue a relationship with them? You can't say, let's go to the club and hear the such and such a band.
Hmm.
There's a concert this weekend. You want to go to the concert with me?
Well, as someone who didn't get married till they were 46, I can tell you that problem's existed long before this time. But I really do hear what you're saying. I mean, it's interesting that that is an example you brought up because you're married, you have children, and we tend to not think of the things that don't affect us. And because there are some really positive things that are coming out of this time. And yet, the one-to-one interaction, and yes, we've all done our Zoom dinners or
Right,
happy
right,
hours,
yeah,
or I even
yeah,
was listening to a podcast earlier today of someone who did their Seder online.
yeah,
And so there are ways to still connect. And in some ways, it's force people to slow down. And, if you sit in front of a screen, at least you're getting in front of someone and communicating. But like you say, to think of what does it mean to be a single person, and trying to meet someone and
Right.
trying to because we all know being in person is a very different chemistry than it is
Sure, sure,
being on the
sure.
phone or being online. So what skill sets, if you will, have you learned to kind of combat any of the fears or your concerns in moving forward?
Well, I think in some ways I still have a lot of fears in part for me personally because of my pre-existing health problems. I'm afraid to do almost anything. And for certainly for my relatives, because younger folks, and I guess this is for younger folks in general, they tend to think they're
To anything.
invincible.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, so then I'm concerned that they'll do something without thinking and it will lead to bad consequences for them. And even as a lot of people have said, even if these young people think they're invincible, you've got a grandfather, you've got a grandmother, you've got some older person, and you could take it to them even. So we are connected, whether we like it or not. And so I'm concerned again how this is changing our whole American lifestyle. And I'm not seeing my way to getting back to what the old normal was. When I first started thinking about teaching online, I'm thinking like, wow, you can't really interact in the same way as you could when the student was sitting right next to you. I mean, even if it's not related to learning activities, you just can't, come to class early and talk to the person sitting next to you and say, "What'd you do this
Right, or
weekend?"
how are you doing, and just checking in with
You know,
them, sure.
right? Yeah. And I just think that the impact this is having on our society right now and for the future is, but now we can just see it's just, everybody's saying it's temporary and maybe, but what will the outcome be after all of this COVID seems to have calmed down? How would we be on the other side of all of that? I'm very concerned about how that will be. I can only go forth with faith. I remember a friend of mine saying after he heard of a certain political candidate being elected, he said, "I'm not worried. God is still in
Mm,
charge."
and that's what we forget,
Right.
and you touched on it earlier, it's like, how could a loving God, and I question that too. How can a loving God allow such and such to happen, or a certain person to be, have the power that they have, and yet we have to remember the end of the story, right?
Right, right. Yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
so is that what makes you hopeful? What
Oh,
does bring you
definitely.
hope?
No doubt. No doubt.
Yeah,
No doubt.
okay.
I definitely, I remember I had a friend who told me she was depressed. And I told her, you know, I look outside and some days I see stormy days and it's all dark and gray and maybe branches are falling down on the trees. And the next day I look up and the sun is shining bright.
Mm.
It's a beautiful day outside. So there are storms, but I have faith that the storms will pass.
Amen. That is
Yeah,
beautiful because that's really life, right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And it's also perspective. So, I think you just answered that, but I was going to ask you, what brings you joy in the midst of the storms then? Is it the hope
Oh,
for the sunshine? Is it hope for listening to your favorite piece of music? What does bring you joy?
listening to music certainly does, especially when I take the time to listen to some of my favorites. I listen to a lot of music and sort of as part of the job, and sometimes I think, that's okay. But I still love listening to Miles. I still love listening to Train. There's some favorites, and that certainly brings me joy listening to them. Talking to, even if it's got to be remotely, I enjoy talking to friends, laughing with friends. I enjoy seeing my family. Four of my five grandkids came by the other day. They all wore their mask when they came near me.
Mm,
Even the 6-year-old knew to put his mask on when he came near me. I was in the back of the house and they were all up in the front of the house. But when he had to come through the back to the back of the house. He put his mask on. It's great. It's great to see them growing up. I have two twin granddaughters who will turn 12 um, Friday, and so I mean, it's great seeing that life is continuing, and they certainly bring me joy to see them and watch them grow, and you know, they drive me little nuts with all the noise they make, but
But what a joyful noise, though,
right,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
But
is there something that you
reading,
oh,
I also enjoy reading too.
I
I
didn't
enjoy
mean to
reading.
cut you off. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, also enjoy reading.
Is there any particular book you're reading lately that you want to share with us?
First of all, I read a lot of books on music, and I enjoy reading books like that. And because I think music has a place in time, and I enjoy it. So it's not only in a lot of ways reading about music, but it's reading about, which is what my course tries to deal with. It tries to say this music existed, it was at its peak of popularity at this particular time in America. And there were forces that caused this music to come up. There were forces that made this music survive. There were certain activities that went along with this music. That's all things that I find fascinating to learn and to teach about.
And that's so important, isn't that, to know the context of how a piece of art was, or when a piece of art was created, um, because it
Right,
puts it in
right.
context. And if you just aren't familiar with that time frame and what the musicians were going through culturally, what was happening, there may not be the depth of understanding as to how, why so passionate, or why so sensitive and beautiful, or why so angry.
Yeah, I think all of that comes to play. I'm reaching for the other book I'm reading. I'm reading a book called The Reality of Our Sacred Human Nature, Our Origins and Our Destiny. That's a book I'm reading right now, too. It's by Fahim Shuaib. I think he's an imam of a mosque in Los Angeles.
That in and of itself, the title is something to chew on.
Right.
Uh, so, Eric, is there something you'd like to tell people that I haven't asked you about? Something you want to leave them with?
Well, I would just say probably that, I got into radio never thinking that it was going to be my career. I got into radio because there was an ad in the campus paper at BU, and they said they would train, no experience necessary. And I got into it thinking, oh, this would be fun to do while I'm in college. And I'd say 51 years later, I'm still having big fun.
That's beautiful. And I know that people are enjoying you being on the air presenting the music. And that is a huge, huge statement in and of itself, to be on the air 51 years, considering how much the different mediums have changed in the way that music is presented and how people access it. And I wish you great health and continued longevity at
Same to you,
WGBH.
Cheryl. Same to you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Eric. And we'll just look forward to the next incarnation of what this means for you and for your teaching. And I just thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Cheryl.
All right, Eric. Thank you so much.
Sure. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today for 19 Stories, From Fear to Hope. I'd like to once again thank Eric Jackson. I wish him many more years of health and happiness and programming great music on Eric in the Evening at WGBH in Boston. Join me next week on 19 Stories when my guest will be Faith Koga, founder of Iger Chicago, which has a community of 34,000 followers. I'd also like to thank the following news outlets for the use of their clips in so aptly painting the picture of the fear that we're facing during this pandemic: BBC, PBS, Now This, UNESCO, and Some Good News. I especially want to thank Joel and Luke Smallborn, otherwise known as the Group for King and Country, for allowing me to use an excerpt of their song Together, which could not be a more hopeful and inspiring song for such a time as this. Finally, I'll leave you with the following from Proverbs 23:18. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Thank you again for joining me today. Feel free to offer feedback or a story idea at 19stories@soundsatchelstudios.com. Visit my website at soundsatchelstudios.com, via Instagram at Cheryl Halling VO. I look forward to sharing more stories on the next episode of 19 Stories From Fear to Hope. Until then, stay healthy and hopeful.
Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.